Thank you very much, Debbie, and thanks to all of you for the gracious and flattering invitation to be with you this evening. What an extraordinary gathering for one of the world's most important Jewish organizations. It is truly a great honor to be here this evening, and I thank you. In 1942, the Argentinian writer Jorge Luis Borges wrote a short story called Funes de Memorias. In this short story, he told the story of a young man named Ireneo Funes who fell off his horse and suffered as a result of the fall a grievous head injury. The strange result of the head injury was that Ireneo was unable to forget anything. Everything he learned, everything he saw, everything he read, he remembered forever. So that talent, or that curse, depending on how you look at it, made it possible for him to learn entire languages in a matter of days, to know things that no one else could know. But at the end of the story, Borges tells us Ireneo died. He died, says Borges, of consumption of the lungs. But you can't help but wonder if what Borges is really saying is that it wasn't so much consumption of the lungs as it was being overwhelmed not by water, but by memory. In 1942, what Borges was trying to say was that if you don't forget anything, then you can't distinguish between what matters and what doesn't, what is key and what is peripheral, what has meaning and what does not. And therefore, in 1942, to his readers, he said, it is a gift to be able to forget. The problem that you and I have is that even those Jews who have never read Funes de Memorias or anything else that Borges wrote have taken his story to heart. Increasingly, we live in a world in which Jews, and especially young Jews, want to move beyond memory. We're tired of hearing about the Holocaust, they say. The story about Israel being in danger is growing tired as well. We don't want to be told that we're different. We're just tired of all of that, so memory is going to take a back seat to just doing good things. But what most of us in this room know is that to leave memory behind is to eviscerate Judaism. To leave memory behind is to make Judaism stand for absolutely nothing. As Jonathan Safran Foer put it brilliantly in his book, Everything is Illuminated, Jews have 6 senses: touch, taste, sight, smell, hearing, and memory. For Jews, memory is not a tool. It's not the way that we recall things. Memory is how we make sense of the world. Memory is our oxygen. Jews see the world not through our eyes, but through our memories, and we are losing that memory. We're losing that memory in large measure because it actually has to be taught. We're losing that memory in large measure because over thousands of years, Jews communicated a national memory by living in closely knit communities where we celebrated both individual and communal events together, and we mourned individual and communal moments together. We taught memory through ritual. Which way we prayed, which direction we faced, told us something about who we were. Which cities we mentioned in the grace after meals and which cities we didn't told us something about who we were. The fact that we could mourn a building that we'd never seen and that many of us might not even want rebuilt, but still wept, taught us something about who we were. And thousands upon thousands of hours of Jewish education taught us that what it meant to be a Jew was not simply to be the person who took in all of this information. Education for Jews is not about information. What it meant to be a Jew was to live inside a story, to live inside a narrative. What it meant to educate our children was to invite them into that story, so that they too on Pesach evening would feel that they had been personally redeemed from Egypt, so that they too on Tisha B'Av would feel that the loss of the temple was their loss as well, so that they too, when they heard about the poetry and the philosophy of great Jewish thinkers during the Golden Age of Spain, would take pride in people who were part of their people, and that they too would feel dizzied when they realized how rapid was the demise of the German Jewish experience of the early 20th century. We live off of memory. We breathe memory. But if memory is our oxygen, then we are actually asphyxiating. Because by having reduced Jewish education to an anemic version of what it once was, we have allowed memory to become weak, to become idle, to become almost vanished altogether. So what I would like to do with you this evening is to revitalize our Jewish memories, to go swimming once again in the ocean of Jewish memory, and to look across the globe and to ask ourselves, fully armed with a robust sense of the Jewish story, how would we read what is happening in the world today? So we'll start with Iran. This is not the place to debate the details of what the exact agreement will be or should be. This is not the place to discuss what we think the ultimate outcome will be. But regardless of what happens in Washington, it may very well be that Iran is moving inexorably towards a bomb. I'll remind you that North Korea did it despite Washington's absolute objections. So this Iranian regime that is probably, or maybe very likely, to get a bomb, what does it say about us? Here is from the Iranian presidential website. The Zionist regime of Israel faces a dead end and will, under God's grace, be wiped off the map. Ahmadinejad in 2008. The Zionist regime has lost its raison d'etre. Today, Palestinians identify with your name, Khomeini, and your memory, and in your path. They are walking in your illuminated path, and the Zionist regime has reached a total dead end. Thanks to God, your wish will soon be realized, and the germ of this corruption will soon be wiped away. Now you can just say, who takes Ahmadinejad seriously? Not the smartest world leader we've ever seen. Certainly not the best-dressed world leader we've ever seen. But what I think Jewish memory would say to us is that when a sworn enemy of the Jewish people tells you that he is going to kill you, you should take him exceedingly seriously. Hitler published Mein Kampf in 1925 and in 1926, a full decade before the Nazi genocidal machine really started to do its work. And we didn't pay any attention. It was a book, we said. He's a painter, we said. So we got elected, we said. And Jews stayed. Jews worried a little bit. But by the time it became patently obvious what was about to happen, the vast majority of those Jews, of course, were trapped and could go nowhere. The point being that if we look at the world in which we live today and we have a deep and profound and abiding sense of what Jewish memory ought to have taught us, we should know this, and I repeat it again. If your enemy tells you that he is going to kill you, take him very seriously. So we move westward, and we get to Europe. And a group like this needs no reprise of what is exactly happening in Europe, no update on what's been happening in France, but we should be reminded of this, that the 475,000 Jews of France who make up less than 1% of the population of France are the targets of 51% of all racial attacks in that country. And when those attacks are camouflaged as objections to Israel's policy in the West Bank or the settlements or the stalled peace process or what have you, too many Jews are fooled. Too many Jews, especially in the United States, look and they say, well, you know, they got a point. But France's prime minister doesn't think they have a point. He says, and I quote, it is legitimate to criticize the policies of Israel. This criticism exists in Israel itself, but that is not what we are talking about in France. This radical criticism of the very existence of Israel is anti-Semitism. There is an incontestable link between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Behind anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. If only Jews around the world, and especially young Jews in this country, had the clarity of thought of the Prime Minister of France. Some people who understand it, of course, are French Jews themselves. In my neighborhood in Jerusalem, not that long ago, a year and a half ago, on a typical Shabbat afternoon, you could take a walk outside when the weather was nice. And you hear, of course, mostly Hebrew, and in my neighborhood, a bunch of English and some Russian. And in these last few weeks and months, as we've been walking outside, what you hear actually mostly is French. The French are moving into the neighborhood in unprecedented numbers. And it's changing virtually everything about the neighborhood. The schools are changing. The bakeries are becoming infinitely better. But while we can actually celebrate finally the advent of a seriously good 7-layer cake in Jerusalem, the reality is that it is unbelievably sad that our neighborhood is changing. Not that it's changing, but because of why it's changing. Britain, hardly a picnic. 2014 saw the highest number of anti-Semitic incidences in the UK since we began monitoring it in 1984. In 2014 alone, 1,168 anti-Semitic incidences, about 3 a day. Last week, British students voted, as you know, to endorse BDS, which is nothing other than a thinly veiled and poorly camouflaged desire to destroy the state of Israel. Sweden, where it all looks good from afar, 60% of the Jews are afraid of being publicly identified. Look across Europe, both across the geography and across the chronology. What have we not been accused of in Europe? The church said that we killed Jesus. Voltaire said we invented the church. People called us usurers and poisoners. The communists said that the Jews created capitalism. The capitalist Jews said the Jews created communism. They were both actually probably right. And now we're colonialists, we're Nazi-like, we're purveyors of apartheid. It's all our fault. They just hate us because of what we do. That's what they say. But as Jeffrey Goldberg points out in an extraordinarily important piece in a recent Atlantic in which he asks, is it time for the Jews to leave Europe? David Rich, an official of the Community Security Trust, an organization in the UK that monitors anti-Semitic activity, noted that yes, it is true that many of the people protesting in the streets are actually Muslim. That's true. But, said David Rich, what's interesting is that when they're chanting in the streets, they're more often than not saying Allahu Akbar. They're saying Heil Hitler. So what would Jewish memory say that we ought to think when we look at Europe? What I think it would say is that we should remember that if they say it's because of settlements or the Green Line or the peace process or Palestinians, all of which, by the way, are important issues, and all of which are issues on which reasonable minds can absolutely differ because they differ in Israel. Not that all of Israel's reasonable minds, but nonetheless, those are all legitimate issues for disagreement. But to suggest that that is the reason for the hatred of the Jew in Europe is simply not to know Jewish history, is simply to have given up on Jewish memory. Because anti-Semitism is a virus, and Europe has the virus. Like all viruses, we don't yet know how to stop it. Like all viruses, it morphs. It might be theological at one point. It could become quasi-scientific in the 19th and early part of the 20th century, and now it's anti-Jewish nationalism, but it's all the same virus. The only difference is that unlike other viruses, in the case of this particular virus, they have the virus, and we die from it. Jewish memory would say that when we look across Europe, we can't simply say, there they go again. Jewish memory would say that whatever virus was in remission for 5 or 6 decades is coming back full bore. So then we cross the ocean and we go further west and we come to the United States of America. Now, everybody knows that Jews are one of the most positively regarded groups anywhere in the United States. And everyone knows that there is no country in the history of the Jewish people that has treated the Jews as well or as wonderfully as the United States of America has. But it's also worth pointing out at the same time that according to the FBI, based on its 2013 statistics, it is the Jews who are most frequently victims of religiously motivated hate crimes in America. And some of us know the story of Rachel Beda at UCLA just a couple of months ago. Rachel Beda is a sophomore, I guess now she's a rising junior at UCLA, and she ran for the student judiciary. And she was supposed to be approved in a rather pro forma kind of a way by the student representatives of the student government, and she was called in just for what should have been a brief conversation. And someone asked her in this meeting, do you really think that you could render a fair and neutral decision given your relationship with the Jewish community? 2015, the University of California, Los Angeles. Somebody tells a young Jewish woman, you probably can't render a fair decision because you're a Jew. And the student council actually votes not to approve her until a faculty member there has an extraordinary insight and points out to them that that might be just slightly problematic, so they voted again and she was taken in. But in 2015, at the University of California, where all the students have a 4.0, literally, I used to live in Los Angeles, you can't get in with less. That's where you ask a young Jewish woman, do you really think you can render a fair decision given the fact that you're a Jew? And what would Jewish memory say about this? I think it would say the following. Just imagine for a moment that the woman who asked that question had asked that question of an African American and had said, do you really think you can render a fair decision given that you're black? Can you imagine that campus the next day? Can you imagine the United States of America the next day? Or imagine that Fabienne Roth, which is the name of the woman who actually asked the question, had asked the question not of a Jew but of a Muslim, and had turned to her and said, do you really think you can render a fair decision given the fact that you're a Muslim? Just imagine what would have happened. But Rachel Beda isn't black, and Rachel Beda is not a Muslim. She's Jewish. So you know what we did? We wrote a lot of blogs. And it's not okay. And it's not funny. Because the truth of the matter is, you and I are all complicit in having made it far too easy to be an anti-Semite. We need to stay within the confines of morality, and we need to stay within the confines of the law to be sure. But it is time for us to let the world know that you cannot be an overt anti-Semite and just walk away and expect no reaction from us. I have no idea what Fabienne Roth wants to be when she's done with college, but let's say hypothetically she wants to be a lawyer. So she should know that any law firm that hires her is going to be the object of our attempt to have every Jewish client and every decent client leave that firm until she is fired. And if she becomes a doctor, whatever hospital hires her, whatever practice hires her, needs to know that there's not going to be a day in which we are not protesting in front of them that they have hired an overt anti-Semite. Fabienne Roth lives someplace. We can find out where that place is, and she should not be able to come in or out of her house, in or out of her apartment, without being reminded, peacefully, morally, legally, that we know who you are and you can no longer blend into the woodwork. We have let it become simply far too easy to be an anti-Semite. David Harris, who directs and gives leadership to this extraordinary organization with great wisdom and with great courage, wrote a column, I think last week or the week before, in which he said, quote, "We haven't shown enough outrage," and boy, is he right. It is time to start showing outrage. It is time to start making it clear that it's legal to be an anti-Semite, but it is not going to be cost-free. Stéphane Richard, the CEO of Orange International, said on Egyptian TV just a few days ago that he wished Orange could be out of Israel tomorrow morning, because Israel. So I went on the web when he said that, Just did a little Googling. Figured, why not? I live in Israel. We probably invented Google somehow. And I put in Orange Telecommunications, Syria. So there's an Orange store in Aleppo, turns out, in the country that has gassed thousands of its children, in the country that has killed hundreds of thousands of its citizens, and in the country that has turned millions of its citizens into refugees. But that's not the country Stefan Richard wants to leave. He wants to leave not Aleppo, not Damascus, he wants to leave Tel Aviv. Well, it's time for us to say to Orange, you have a CEO like that, it comes with costs. Because there are lots of corporations all over the world that have contracts with Orange where we have something to say about those corporations. We're either on the board of directors, or we own shares, or we work in them, or we're the advertisers that help them sell their products. We're the lawyers for those corporations, whatever it may be. We have some reach. And it's time to say to Orange International, you want a CEO like that? That's fine, but where you're going to be leaving is not Israel. You're going to be leaving every organization and every corporation on which we have the slightest bit of influence. So we look at Iraq, and I think that robust Jewish memory would remind us that when your enemy tells you who's going to kill you, take him very seriously. When we look at Europe, and we see the virus of anti-Semitism spreading like wildfire once again, let us not be duped by, oh, what did we do this time? It must be Israel. Let us understand that it is a sickness that has gotten hold of Europe for thousands of years, and this is just the latest iteration of that morphing virus. And we will look at what's happening both in the United States and in Europe, and we see people unabashedly espouse anti-Semitic views. Let us determine tonight and from here on in that there's going to be a cost to that. And finally, we can't speak about Iran or Europe or the United States without, of course, saying something about Israel. And time is too short tonight to go into the whole issue of the peace process and settlements and Israel's current political leadership and all the things that we all tend to like to debate. But just a couple of things to remind ourselves the level to which the conversation about Israel has descended. The UN Secretary General's envoy for children and armed conflict. Didn't know there was one until a week or two ago, but the UN Secretary General has an envoy for children and armed conflict. And this guy maintains a blacklist of countries and organizations that regularly cause harm to children. And he proposed last week that the latest organization that ought to be added to that list is the Israel Defense Forces. People on that list so far: Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, Islamic State, the Taliban, the Republic of Congo. And you want to add the Israel Defense Forces to that list? That is what the world is talking about. And lest anybody imagine that moving a settlement or moving a line or getting rid of a checkpoint, all of which may be perfectly good ideas, that it's going to change that is deluding themselves. As you're probably aware, the Palestinians came this close last week to getting Israel kicked out of FIFA, the International Federation of Soccer Organization. Yair Lapid, a well-known Israeli politician, said to the Israeli press last week in all seriousness that he foresees a time not too long in the future when Israel will be excluded from the Olympics. Now, the good news is that Israel's being excluded from the Olympics will not in any material way affect the number of medals that we win. But let us understand exactly what's going on. If it was once the case that it was the Jew who was peripheral and ostracized, now it's just the Jewish state that is peripheral and ostracized. But what I want to spend just a couple of minutes talking about Israel tonight is not the conflict, but the reaction of many American Jews, especially young people, but not only young people, who are deeply distressed by Israel's current political leadership, who feel that Israel is moving in a direction of which they cannot be proud. I don't want to debate the merits of the case. There are people who love the leadership, there are people who don't like the leadership. There's people who think Israel's moving in the right direction, people who think Israel's moving in the wrong direction. Again, reasonable minds can differ. But in the last 10 years in the United States, virtually every single American has lived under a president who they thought was taking this country down the drain and selling the world short. One president or the other. In this country, there are actually some people who think that both presidents were guilty of that. But how many serious Americans under either Bush or Obama, it makes no difference, looked at the president and said, I don't like the direction of this particular administration, and I am therefore washing my hands of America. I'm done. And I want to ask those young American Jews and those not so young American Jews who look at whatever Israelis vote into office because of a whole array of complex reasons and don't like it, which is legitimate, and say, I just can't do it anymore. I'm getting ready to be done. Really? I'm getting ready to be done because Bibi Netanyahu won for a third or fourth time? I'm getting ready to be done with the state that is charged with preserving the Jewish people. I'm getting ready to be done with the state that makes it clear that there's no Jew on planet Earth that doesn't have a home. I'm getting ready to be done with the one place on earth which has brought back to life the Hebrew language and Jewish culture and things that can happen nowhere else. I'm getting ready to be done because I don't like the division of the Knesset. Serious Jewish memory does not allow that. Serious Jewish memory says to us, you take the long run. You read the Bible tells us there were some bad kings. And it's not always clear, by the way, who were the bad kings and who were the good kings, because some of them had really, really difficult choices to make. And there were some mediocre kings, and there were great kings. There was King David, the poet, the military leader, the artisan. Peoples have all sorts of leaders, and if you're part of a people, you see it through, thick and thin. You don't wait for an administration to come that you don't like and say, I'm done. Not if you're serious, because our enemies are going to stick with their plan. So we had darn well better stick with ours. Jewish memory says, therefore, if your enemies tell you they're going to kill you, take them very seriously. Jewish memory tells you that if they're accusing you in Europe and saying that the reason they're against you is because of what's happening in your country, look at Europe over 2,000 years and ask yourself how plausible that is. Jewish memory says if you're looking around the world these days, we've made it far too easy to be an anti-Semite, and Jewish memory says Jews have to have the long run in mind here. Jews have to see this in a much more global kind of a way, because memory has the capacity to actually urge us on to action. And I want to share with you a personal story about that by way of conclusion. It goes back to Hanukkah in December of 2008. It was Operation Cast Lead. And my daughter, who most importantly now is the mother of my granddaughter, but back then she wasn't. She was just out of the army and in her first year of law school. She called me up one day during Hanukkah and she said, you're not going to believe this. My commander from the army called me up and he said, this is completely off the record, but you should be prepared to get called up. So I said to her, so if you get called up, you'll get called up. And she said, I'm in law school. I'm in the first year of law school. They're not shutting down law school. I'm going to miss weeks of school. What's going to happen? We'll deal, I said. A couple days later, in fact, she got the call. It was time to go back to the army. She came home because all of her gear was up in the attic. She had to get the boots and the pants and the shirt and the backpack and whatever. And she came into the house, and I could see that her eyes were red. She was in a terrible mood, and my wife and I were putting the candles in the Chanukiah to light candles that night. And Tali walked upstairs to go get her stuff. And I said to my wife, when Tali comes downstairs, we are going to have a massive meltdown. And she said, we'll deal with it, by which she meant, you'll deal with it. And sure enough, Tali came down. It was just the three of us. The boys were out wherever they were, probably in the army at that point. And we began to light candles. And she's a little, tiny little thing. And I had my arm around her. And I could feel that as we were singing the blessings, and then as we were singing Hanerot Halalu, this song that we sing about what we use the candles for, she was more crying than singing. She was worried about school. She was actually going that night into Gaza. Who wouldn't be scared? And I had my arm around her, but I could feel just more crying than anything else. And we were singing Maoz Tzur. Maoz Tzur that has a stanza about Pharaoh and how we beat Pharaoh in the end. A stanza about the Babylonians and how in the end they couldn't do us in. A stanza about Persia and Haman, you know what happened to him. A stanza about the Greeks, which is, of course, the reason for Hanukkah in the first place. And then there is a stanza at the end of Maoz Tzur that was added much later. It says, Chasof zroa kodshecha v'karev keitz hayeshua. Bear your sacred arm and bring about the time of deliverance. Ki archa lanu hayeshua ve'ein keitz limei hara'a. Because salvation is taking too long to come and there is no end to the evil. And we sang it. Tali speaks Hebrew. I felt her whole body change. She stood up straight. She stopped crying. And she started to sing. Because it's true what Maoz Tzur says. Ki archa lanu hayeshua ve'ein keitz limei hara'a. It is taking too long for the world to be redeemed, and there's no end to the evil. And she sang that song. She put on her green parka, put on her backpack, gave us a kiss, walked out the door and took a bus to go to war. And I tell you that story because it's my constant annual reminder as we light Hanukkah candles that the real value of Jewish memory is that it goads us to act. It gets us to do stuff, and it is time for all of us to start to act. We live in very sad times. We live in dark times. We live in times that we had hoped might be behind us, but they're not. The road ahead is going to be long and it is going to be difficult, but we have to remember the glories of the past that we want to preserve, the tradition that we have of contributing to humankind, wherever they are and however they are, the vicious enemies that we faced over thousands of years, but that somehow we've prevailed. We have to remember that that's why this great organization, American Jewish Committee, exists to teach and to protect and to organize Jews all across the world. We have to teach our children to remember. We have to teach our children that they too have to make sure that it becomes much more difficult to be an anti-Semite. We have to teach our children that throughout history there has been no one to look out for us except for us. And you and I, and eventually they, we must act. We must act and we must work with dignity, with decency, and with energy, and with profound conviction to make sure that because of us, the greatest days of the Jewish people and the greatest days of the Jewish state lie not in the past, but in a glorious future that we can create together. Thank you very much.